He did not rise through NASA the traditional way. He was not a test pilot turned agency insider. He did not spend decades moving through the bureaucracy. He was not a former senator, general, or career administrator. He was something different. A businessman, a pilot, an entrepreneur, a private citizen who looked up at space and decided he was not content just to admire it from the ground. And then he did something even more unusual. He went, not as a passenger in the old sense, not as a symbolic guest, but as part of a new era, one where access to space was beginning to change, where the line between government mission and private ambition was becoming harder to define. Now, that same man sits at the center of the most important civil space agency on Earth. Jared Isaacman is not just another NASA administrator. He may be the clearest sign yet that the future of American spaceflight will not look like its past. So the question is not simply who he is. The question is what his rise means for NASA, for Artemis, for the growing partnership between public exploration and private industry, and for all of us watching the next chapter of spaceflight unfold in real time. Because when the astronaut becomes the administrator, the story changes, and that story starts now.
This episode is brought to you by Retrojet Studios. If you're into spaceflight, NASA history, and clean, mission-inspired design, you can explore posters, collectibles, and more at retrojetstudios.com.
Welcome to Orbital Briefing, the podcast where we explore the missions, the people, and the science that built humanity's journey into space. From Mercury to Artemis, we dive deep into the stories behind the rockets that carried us beyond Earth. This is Orbital Briefing.
And this is where we zoom out, because no story in spaceflight happens in a vacuum. Not a launch, not a program, and definitely not a NASA administrator. Mission context is where we step back from the individual and look at the world around the mission. The political climate, the technological moment, the cultural shift, the pressures, the opportunities, and the reasons this story is happening now and not 10 years ago. Because if you want to understand the person, you first have to understand the moment that made that person matter. And in the case of Jared Isaacman, the moment is everything. NASA today is operating in a very different America than the one that launched Apollo. Back then, the model was straightforward. The federal government set the agenda, funded the hardware, directed the mission, and carried the public imagination with it. NASA was the unquestioned center of American spaceflight. But that is not the world Isaacman inherited. Modern NASA is still one of the most important scientific and exploration institutions on Earth. But it now works inside a much more complex ecosystem. It leads, but it also partners. It sets goals, but increasingly relies on commercial providers, private industry, and shared infrastructure to get there. You can see that clearly in today's NASA, where human spaceflight priorities include returning astronauts to the moon, building the first elements of a long-term lunar presence, sustaining American leadership in low Earth orbit, and pushing new capabilities like nuclear propulsion. That shift did not happen overnight. It grew out of decades of change. The shuttle era ended, commercial space matured, launch costs began to change, private companies stopped being side players and started becoming central players. And for the first time in generations, some of the boldest momentum in human spaceflight was not coming only from government centers, but from entrepreneurial companies and privately funded missions. That is the environment Jared Isaacman came from. And that is what makes his arrival at NASA so unusual, because he is not simply another administrator stepping into a traditional federal leadership role. He represents the era that came after the old model began to evolve. He is a pilot, an entrepreneur, and a space flyer whose public reputation was built not through NASA's internal ranks, but through the rise of commercial spaceflight. Before leading the agency, he had already become one of the most visible symbols of the new space age through missions like Inspiration4 and Polaris. And NASA's own biography highlights Inspiration4 as a major milestone in commercial human spaceflight. And that matters because NASA is now at a point where the administrator is not just managing a legacy institution. He is helping define how that institution coexists with a rapidly changing space economy. That means balancing tradition and innovation, science and spectacle, government oversight and private capability, long-term national goals, and the faster, more agile rhythm of commercial development. It also means leading at a moment when the stakes are high. NASA is not in a quiet period right now. It is in one of the most consequential transition points since the end of Apollo. The Artemis program is meant to return humans to the lunar surface and build toward a sustained presence beyond low Earth orbit. NASA's current public messaging under Isaacman also points to long-range goals like a permanent lunar base and advanced in-space propulsion. In other words, this is not just about flags and footprints anymore. This is about infrastructure, endurance, and what comes after the first return. So when Jared Isaacman took the oath as NASA's 15th administrator in December of 2025, it was more than a personnel change. It was a statement. A statement that NASA's future may be shaped by someone who understands not only the mythology of spaceflight, but the commercial forces now driving much of its momentum. A statement that the boundary between public service and private innovation has become thinner than ever. And a statement that the next chapter of American spaceflight may be written by leaders who have lived in both worlds. That is the mission context for this episode. This is not just the story of a man who took over NASA. It is the story of a moment when NASA itself is changing. A moment when the agency is trying to go farther, build faster, and work differently than it has before. And a moment when the person chosen to lead it is, in many ways, a product of that transformation. Because to understand Jared Isaacman, you have to understand this first. He did not step into the old NASA. He stepped into the NASA of Artemis, commercial partnership, and a new race for the future. And that is what makes his story worth telling. Before we get into the people behind the story, this is the part of the show I call the architecture, and this is where we look at the systems behind the vision. Because in spaceflight, big ideas are never enough on their own. Ambition has to be translated into hardware, infrastructure, timelines, mission design, and an overall strategy that connects one flight to the next. The architecture is where we look at how the future is actually being built, not just the rocket, not just the capsule, but the full framework that makes exploration possible. And in this episode, that matters more than ever, because Jared Isaacman did not take over NASA at a time when the agency was focused on a single vehicle or a single destination. He stepped into a much larger system, one NASA describes as its Moon to Mars architecture. That architecture is built in stages, with NASA organizing it around human lunar return, foundational exploration, sustained lunar evolution, and eventually humans to Mars. In other words, the job is not simply to launch the next mission, it is to manage a chain of missions that are supposed to build on one another over time. At the center of that architecture, at least in the near term, is Artemis. Artemis is NASA's campaign to return astronauts to the moon, build long-term capability there, and use that experience to prepare for Mars. NASA's current Artemis framework still relies on a familiar backbone, the Space Launch System, or SLS, and the Orion spacecraft. Orion is designed to carry and sustain crews on lunar missions and bring them safely back to Earth, while SLS remains the heavy-lift launch vehicle that gets Orion off the pad and out toward deep space. But this is where the architecture starts to look very different from Apollo. Apollo was built around a largely government-owned stack. Artemis is more distributed. NASA's updated architecture now includes not just SLS and Orion, but commercial lunar landers, lunar orbit infrastructure, docking tests, evolving mission cadence, and a growing mix of public and private systems. Earlier this month, NASA announced a refined Artemis architecture that adds a 2027 mission focused on testing capabilities closer to Earth before sending astronauts to the lunar surface, with the broader goal of achieving roughly one lunar mission per year after that. That matters because the future NASA is building is not based on one giant leap alone. It is based on interoperability. NASA's own Moon to Mars strategy emphasizes common standards, linked systems, and the ability for different vehicles, crews, and mission elements to work together across the campaign. That is why Artemis 3, as currently outlined by NASA, is built around rendezvous and docking between Orion and commercial spacecraft needed for the lunar landing. So the architecture Isaacman inherits is not just a launch architecture, it is an integration architecture, a system of systems. Then there is Gateway. Gateway is planned as a lunar orbit outpost and a major piece of the longer-term Artemis framework. NASA describes it as essential to the Artemis architecture, with Orion delivering crew there and human landing systems docking there on later missions. That makes Gateway more than a space station around the moon. It is part of NASA's attempt to create repeatable infrastructure beyond low Earth orbit. something more durable than a one-off mission profile. And just as important as the lunar side of this story is what happens closer to Earth. NASA is actively preparing for a future where it is no longer the operator of the only major American destination in low Earth orbit. The agency's commercial low Earth orbit development program is intended to help create privately owned and operated orbital destinations, with NASA becoming one customer among many rather than the sole anchor of the entire system. NASA has said directly that its goal is a strong low Earth orbit economy from which the agency can buy services as one of many customers. And if that sounds familiar, it should, because that is the world Jared Isaacman came from. Before he became NASA administrator, Isaacman had already become one of the most visible faces of commercial human spaceflight. NASA's own biography notes that he commanded Inspiration4, the first all-civilian orbital spaceflight aboard Dragon, and SpaceX describes Polaris Dawn as another mission he commanded as part of a broader effort to rapidly advance human spaceflight capabilities. So when he looks at architecture, he is not looking at it only from the perspective of a federal manager. He has lived inside the commercial side of the equation. That is what makes this architecture section so important for this episode, because the architecture Jared Isaacman now oversees is really a blending of two spaceflight philosophies. One is the classic NASA model, long-range planning, safety culture, public accountability, and exploration on behalf of the nation. The other is the commercial model, faster iteration, private investment, greater flexibility, and the idea that government does not have to own every piece of the stack in order to lead. NASA's current Moon to Mars strategy openly reflects that blend by calling for the use of low Earth orbit infrastructure, growth of the economic sphere beyond Earth, and interoperability across systems and partners. So when we talk about the architecture in this episode, we are really talking about the shape of modern American spaceflight itself. It is SLS and Orion, it is commercial landers, it is Gateway, it is Artemis mission cadence, it is the shift toward commercial stations in low Earth orbit, and it is the larger Moon to Mars framework that is trying to connect all of it into one coherent path forward. And that is the key thing to understand before we move on. Jared Isaacman is not stepping in to manage a single spacecraft. He is stepping in to help steer an architecture that is bigger, more interconnected, and more commercially intertwined than anything NASA has attempted before. And in many ways, he may be the perfect figure for that moment, because this architecture is not just about where NASA is going, it is about how NASA now gets there. Before we get into the timeline of events, this is the part of the show I call the people. Because spaceflight is never just a story about rockets, capsules, or mission plans. It is always, at its core, a story about human beings, the people who imagine the future, the people who take the risks, the people who build, lead, test, decide, and sometimes completely change the direction of an entire program. And in this episode, the people matters a little more than usual, because Jared Isaacman is not interesting only because of the office he now holds. He is interesting because of the path he took to get there. NASA has had administrators from political backgrounds, military backgrounds, scientific backgrounds, and management backgrounds. But Isaacman arrives as something a little different. NASA's own leadership page describes him as an entrepreneur and skilled pilot, and notes that he commanded Inspiration4, the first all-civilian orbital spaceflight aboard Dragon. That alone makes him unusual. He is not a product of the classic NASA pipeline. He did not become nationally known by rising through the agency or by commanding a traditional government mission. He became visible as part of the new era of commercial spaceflight, the era where private citizens, private capital, and private missions started becoming a real part of the broader human spaceflight story. NASA now identifies him not just as its 15th administrator, but as a pioneer in commercial spaceflight. And that gives him a different kind of profile. He is, in many ways, a bridge figure. Part aviator, part entrepreneur, part astronaut, and now part steward of one of the most important public institutions in American life. According to NASA's official biography, Isaacman grew up in New Jersey, developed an early fascination with aviation and space, later earned a bachelor's degree in aeronautics from Embry-Riddle, and was nominated to lead NASA on November 4th, 2025, before being confirmed by the Senate on December 17th, 2025. But titles only tell part of the story. What makes Isaacman compelling in this episode is that he seems to embody a very modern version of the American space narrative, not the government hero of the Apollo era, not the purely institutional manager, but the self-made flyer, the private sector builder, the person who looked at space not as a distant national achievement from another generation, but as something he might actively participate in during his own lifetime. That changes the emotional texture of his story. Because to many listeners, Jared Isaacman may feel more contemporary than the traditional image of a NASA chief. He comes from a world of entrepreneurial momentum, fast-moving technology, commercial partnerships, and high-visibility missions that captured public attention in a different way than the old government-only model ever did. And of course, there is another reason his story lands so differently. He did not just advocate for spaceflight, he flew. NASA credits him with commanding Inspiration4, which it describes as the first all-civilian orbital spaceflight, a mission the agency calls a major milestone in commercial spaceflight. SpaceX's Polaris Dawn page also identifies Isaacman as mission commander and notes that he had previously flown as commander of Inspiration4. That matters, because when he talks about risk, mission design, crewed flight, and the future of exploration, he is not speaking as a distant executive looking down from a conference room table. He has strapped in, he has launched, he has lived through the physical and emotional reality of going to space. That does not make him infallible, but it does make him different. There is a credibility that comes from lived experience, and in a role like NASA administrator, that lived experience gives his leadership a texture that is hard to fake. He is not just managing the idea of human spaceflight, he has participated in it. And then there is the larger cast around him, because no NASA administrator operates alone. When Isaacman stepped into office in December 2025, he entered an agency with a vast leadership structure already in motion. NASA's organization page shows an Office of the Administrator supported by senior leaders across program management, safety, and mission assurance, engineering, medicine, communications, legislative affairs, and more. In other words, the people in this story are not only the man at the top, but the thousands of experts and public servants who turn policy into missions and strategy into real-world execution. That is worth pausing on. Because it is easy, especially in a narrative like this, to focus on Isaacman as the singular figure. But NASA is not a one-man story. It never has been. Every launch, every spacecraft, every lunar plan, every budget fight, every safety review, every mission rule, every engineering sign-off, every crew decision, and every future milestone depends on teams. Engineers, astronauts, managers, technicians, planners, scientists, communicators, and contractors. The administrator may set the tone, but the agency moves through the work of many hands. And that may actually be one of the most important things to understand about Jared Isaacman. He enters NASA with an outsider's path, but he now leads an insider's institution. He comes from a world that values speed and innovation, but he now sits atop a culture built around rigor, accountability, and long memory. That tension is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. Because the question is not simply, who is Jared Isaacman? The deeper question is, what happens when someone shaped by commercial spaceflight takes the helm of the nation's civil space agency? What does he preserve? What does he accelerate? What does he challenge? And what does he reveal about where NASA is headed next? That is why the people section matters here. Because before this is a story about policy or architecture, it is a story about personality, background, worldview, and experience. Jared Isaacman is not just another name on NASA's leadership timeline, although NASA now officially lists him there as serving from December 18th, 2025 to the present. He is a symbol of a changing era in American spaceflight, one where the barriers between entrepreneur, astronaut, and national leader have grown thinner than ever before. And with that in mind, we can move into the story itself. Because once you understand the person, the next question becomes how he got here.
If you're enjoying this episode, this is exactly what the American spaceplane was built for. It's a full-length book that dives deeper into the space shuttle program, the engineering decisions, the risks, and the moments that defined it. If you want the deeper version of everything we talk about here, you can find the American spaceplane at retrojetstudios.com.
Now we come to the part of the show I call Mission Log. This is where we move from context to chronology, because once we understand the world around the story, the architecture behind it, and the people at the center of it, the next step is to ask a simple question. How did we get here? Mission Log is where we walk through the timeline, the key moments, the turning points, the sequence of events that took this story from possibility to reality. And in this case, that reality is extraordinary, because the path that brought Jared Isaacman to the head of NASA did not begin inside the agency. It began outside it. Long before he took the oath as NASA administrator, Isaacman had already built a reputation as a pilot and entrepreneur. NASA's official biography describes him as an entrepreneur and skilled pilot, and notes that his national profile in spaceflight grew through commanding Inspiration4, the first all-civilian orbital spaceflight aboard Dragon. That mission was one of the first major turning points in his public story. Inspiration4 was not just another private flight, it was a cultural marker. It suggested that commercial human spaceflight was moving beyond the experimental phase and into something more visible, more ambitious, and more influential in the public imagination. NASA itself describes the mission as a major milestone in commercial spaceflight. And Isaacman did not stop there. His role in the Polaris program pushed that identity even further. NASA's Office of Inspector General noted that Isaacman and SpaceX announced 3 additional crewed flights under Polaris, and SpaceX has described Polaris Dawn as part of a broader effort to rapidly advance human spaceflight capabilities. In other words, he was not simply enjoying the experience of going to space. He was becoming associated with the expansion of what private human spaceflight could look like. That matters because it changed what his name represented. By the time he entered the conversation around NASA leadership, Jared Isaacman was no longer just a businessman with an interest in aviation. He had become one of the most visible public faces of the commercial space era, a figure who seemed to embody a new model of American space ambition, one rooted in private initiative but deeply connected to the broader national story of exploration. Then came the formal political turning point. On November 4th, 2025, President Donald J. Trump nominated Isaacman to serve as NASA administrator. NASA's official biography and NASA's announcement welcoming him to the agency both cite that nomination date. That nomination immediately raised the stakes, because this was not just a symbolic appointment. NASA was and is in the middle of one of the most consequential exploration periods since Apollo. Artemis, commercial low Earth orbit development, lunar infrastructure, and long-range moon to Mars planning were all in motion. So the question was not only whether Isaacman was an interesting choice, the real question was what his appointment said about the direction of the agency itself. Then, on December 17, 2025, the U.S. Senate confirmed him. The next day, December 18, 2025, he was sworn in as NASA's 15th administrator. NASA's official release says the oath was administered by District Judge Timothy J. Kelly, and NASA's historical personnel page now lists Isaacman as serving from December 18, 2025 to the present. And that is the moment when this story truly changed shape. Up until then, Jared Isaacman had represented an adjacent future, a possible future, the commercial future, the entrepreneurial future, the astronaut outside the system future. But after December 18th, he was no longer orbiting NASA's story from the outside. He was NASA's story. He was the person tasked with leading the agency through a moment defined by high expectations, major programs, public scrutiny, and a rapidly evolving relationship between government and private industry. NASA's own current leadership and organization pages now place him at the head of the Office of the Administrator, supported by a broad senior leadership team across the agency. And almost immediately, the tone of that leadership began to show. Since taking office, NASA releases have quoted Isaacman on workforce development, financial stewardship, commercial partnership, and human spaceflight. In January, he highlighted the value of NASA innovation beyond the mission itself. In February, he framed Crew 12 as a demonstration of professionalism, preparation, and teamwork. And in March, NASA announced a major policy update event featuring Isaacman's remarks on mission priorities that included returning astronauts to the lunar surface, establishing the initial elements of a permanent lunar base, and advancing nuclear propulsion. Those are not the words of a caretaker. Those are the words of someone trying to define an era. That is what makes the mission log of this episode so compelling. It is not just the story of a nomination and confirmation. It is the story of convergence. The convergence of commercial spaceflight and public leadership. The convergence of private experience and national responsibility. the convergence of a man shaped by a new era of access to space with an agency trying to decide what its own next era will look like. And when you line those moments up, the sequence becomes clear. First, Jared Isaacman became a symbol of a new kind of astronaut. Then, he became a symbol of a new kind of space leader. And finally, he became the official steward of the institution most associated with America's space future. That is the mission log, not a launch countdown, not a flight plan, but a chain of events that led from private cockpit to public office, from Dragon capsule to NASA headquarters, and from commercial mission commander to administrator of the agency that still carries the nation's highest aspirations in space. And once you see that timeline clearly, the next question becomes unavoidable. What does it actually mean? And now we come to the part of the show called Why It Matters. This is where we step back from the timeline and ask the bigger question. Not just what happened, not just who was chosen, but why this story actually matters in the larger arc of American spaceflight. Because a NASA administrator is never just a manager. The person in that role helps set tone, define priorities, shape public confidence, influence partnerships, and decide how boldly the agency moves at a moment when the stakes are high. And right now, NASA is not in a quiet holding pattern. It is actively trying to return astronauts to the moon, build a sustainable exploration framework beyond low Earth orbit, grow the commercial space economy, and prepare for a future path to Mars. NASA's own Moon to Mars strategy emphasizes interoperability across systems, leveraging low Earth orbit infrastructure and fostering the expansion of commerce beyond Earth orbit. So the first reason this matters is simple. Jared Isaacman represents the era NASA is entering. He is not just leading the agency during a commercial space age. He comes from it. NASA officially highlights him as the commander of Inspiration4, the first all-civilian orbital spaceflight aboard Dragon, and frames that mission as a major milestone in commercial spaceflight. That means his presence at the top of NASA is symbolic as well as practical. It says that the boundary between public exploration and private capability has become much thinner than it used to be. And that matters because modern NASA is not trying to do everything alone. The Artemis campaign, the Moon to Mars framework, and NASA's push toward a commercially supported future in low Earth orbit all point in the same direction. Partnership is no longer a side strategy. It is part of the core model. NASA's strategy documents explicitly call for leveraging low Earth orbit infrastructure and expanding the economic sphere beyond Earth orbit, while the agency's commercial low Earth orbit efforts are designed around NASA becoming one customer among many in a broader orbital economy. In other words, the old model of NASA as the singular center of every major human spaceflight activity is continuing to evolve. The second reason it matters is leadership style. Isaacman's public remarks since taking office suggest a tone built around urgency, capability, and execution. In NASA's March 3rd Artemis architecture update, he said the United States needs to move faster, eliminate delays, and progress through objectives in a logical, phased approach. That is not the language of drift. That is the language of momentum. It suggests an administrator who wants to accelerate progress rather than simply preserve process. And for a lot of listeners, that is going to feel encouraging, because spaceflight has always been powered not only by engineering, but by confidence. People want to believe that the agency still knows how to do hard things. They want to believe the future is being built by leaders who understand both risk and ambition. Isaacman's profile helps reinforce that image, because he is not asking others to do something he only understands in theory. He has flown to space himself, and NASA has repeatedly foregrounded that fact in its own leadership materials. The third reason this matters is Artemis. NASA's current plans are bigger than a single mission. The agency updated the Artemis architecture in March 2026, adding another mission and refining the sequence with the goal of standardizing vehicle configurations, increasing flight rate, and moving through objectives in a more logical progression. That tells us something important. NASA is trying to turn Artemis from a series of isolated milestones into a more durable campaign architecture. And if that campaign succeeds, it will define this era the same way Apollo defined the 1960s, and the shuttle defined a later generation. So when Jared Isaacman becomes the person guiding that effort, it matters far beyond biography. It matters because his leadership will influence whether Artemis feels like a bold national return to deep space, or just another stop-and-start program weighed down by delay. It matters because the cadence, clarity, and confidence of NASA's leadership can affect how the public, Congress, industry, and international partners see the program. And it matters because if the Moon to Mars architecture is going to hold together, it needs someone who can think across systems, across partners, and across very different institutional cultures. NASA's own strategy language reflects exactly that need for common standards, linked infrastructure, and coordinated development. The fourth reason it matters is talent. One of the most underappreciated realities of space leadership is that the future depends on whether great people still want to be part of it. NASA announced in March 2026 a recruiting initiative with the Office of Personnel Management, and Isaacman said America's leadership in space depends on extraordinary talent and on attracting the next generation of innovators and technical experts. That may sound like a small administrative point, but it is not. The next era of exploration will be built not just by the leaders at the top, but by the engineers, scientists, operators, and program managers who decide to devote their lives to the mission. And then there is the final reason this matters. It matters because this appointment tells us something about what kind of national story NASA still wants to be. NASA could have chosen to present itself as purely institutional, purely cautious, purely managerial. Instead, the agency now has a leader whose public identity is tied to flight, entrepreneurship, and visible participation in the new space age. That choice sends a message. It says NASA still intends to be ambitious. It says the agency understands the center of gravity in spaceflight is shifting. And it says that if America is entering a new golden age of exploration, NASA wants to lead it, not just observe it. NASA's own public messaging in early 2026 has leaned into that exact idea of a new era of exploration and innovation. So why does Jared Isaacman matter? Because he is bigger than a personnel announcement. He is a signal that NASA is trying to move faster. A signal that commercial space is no longer adjacent to the national program, but deeply woven into it. A signal that Artemis is not supposed to be the end goal, but the opening phase of something larger. And a signal that the next chapter of American spaceflight may be led by people who have one foot in the old world of national exploration and one foot in the new world of private capability. That is why it matters. And finally, we come to the orbital debrief. This is where we bring it all back together, not as a timeline, not as a technical breakdown, not even as a leadership profile, but as a takeaway. What should we carry forward after looking at the context, the architecture, the people, and the story itself? And for this episode, I think the answer is this. Jared Isaacman is not important simply because he became NASA administrator. He is important because of what his leadership represents. NASA now officially lists him as its 15th administrator, sworn in on December 18, 2025. At the same time, the agency is in the middle of a major transition, with Artemis 2 slated for 2026 and NASA refining a broader lunar architecture that now includes an added 2027 mission to test systems before future landings. That combination is what makes this moment so compelling, because this is not NASA in a holding pattern. This is not NASA preserving a legacy and waiting for the next chapter to begin. This is the next chapter, a chapter where the old image of spaceflight, government-led, slow-moving, singular, is being joined by something newer, a model built around partnerships, commercial capability, and a larger, more interconnected exploration strategy. NASA's own current plans reflect that shift, from Artemis mission updates to a broader Moon to Mars architecture designed around phased capability building rather than one isolated leap. And that is why Isaacman fits the story so well. He is not coming into the role as a symbol of the past. He is arriving as a symbol of convergence. The convergence of public and private spaceflight. The convergence of astronaut experience and executive leadership. The convergence of national ambition and commercial momentum. NASA's own biography emphasizes both sides of that identity. He is the agency's administrator, but he is also publicly defined by his role commanding Inspiration4, the first all-civilian orbital spaceflight, which NASA describes as a major milestone in commercial spaceflight. So as we close this briefing, maybe the biggest takeaway is not whether Jared Isaacman fits the traditional image of a NASA chief. Maybe the bigger point is that he does not have to. because the future NASA is trying to build does not fit the traditional image either. It is broader, faster, more networked, more commercially intertwined. And if NASA succeeds, it will not be because it recreated Apollo word for word. It will be because it found a way to carry forward Apollo's ambition into a very different era. NASA's March 2026 Artemis update explicitly framed the revised architecture around moving faster, reducing delays, and creating a more logical progression of missions. That is what makes this worth watching. Not just the man, not just the title, but the direction. Because when history looks back on this period, it may not remember Jared Isaacman simply as the 15th administrator of NASA. It may remember him as the person who arrived at the moment when the agency had to decide what it wanted to become next. And whether that future leads to a stronger Artemis program, a sustained return to the moon, and eventually Mars, remains to be seen. But one thing is already clear. This is no longer a side story in the evolution of American spaceflight. It is one of the main stories, and we are watching it unfold in real time. Jared Isaacman's story is still unfolding, and maybe that is what makes this moment feel so powerful. We are not looking back on a finished chapter. We are living through the opening pages of something new. A new era for NASA, a new era for Artemis, and maybe, in some ways, a new era for the American space program itself, because this is bigger than one appointment. It is bigger than one title. It is about what happens when the people leading our future in space no longer come from just one path, one system, or one tradition. It is about what happens when experience, ambition, risk, and vision all meet at the same point in time. NASA has always been one of the clearest expressions of what this country can do when it chooses to dream big, when it decides that exploration matters, when it believes that the future is worth building. And now, with Jared Isaacman at the helm, that future feels like it is entering a new phase, one that still carries the weight of history, but also the energy of change. Whether his leadership ultimately becomes a turning point, a bridge, or the start of something even larger, one thing is already clear. This matters, because the story of NASA has never only been about spacecraft. It has always been about people. The people willing to imagine more, the people willing to go, and the people willing to lead when the path ahead is still uncertain. That is what makes this story worth watching. This has been Orbital Briefing. I'm Ron Walker. New episodes drop every Thursday, so if you enjoyed today's briefing, be sure to like, follow, and give us 5 stars wherever you listen. And next week, we're going all the way back to the beginning with Sputnik, the beginning of the space age. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next briefing.
If you want to stay connected between episodes, you can follow Orbital Briefing on TikTok. That's where you'll find shorter mission updates, quick breakdowns, and moments from spaceflight history in a more visual format. Just search Orbital Briefing on TikTok, and you'll find it there. Thanks for listening to Orbital Briefing.
Thanks for listening to Orbital Briefing. This show is hosted by Ron Walker and is a production of Retrojet Studios. If you enjoyed the episode, please remember to follow the show, leave a review, and share it with a fellow space enthusiast. To follow all things space, visit retrojetstudios.com. Until next time, keep looking up.